All right, let's go. Number 10. Poverty Point in 1952. Archaeologist James Ford and physician-turned-fieldworker Clarence Webb drove out to a stretch of Louisiana farmland on the west bank of Bayou Macon, near the town of Epes, and cut their first test trenches into what aerial photographs had been showing for years. 6 concentric, curved ridges arcing through the flat alluvial plain of northeastern Louisiana. Too large and too regular to be anything but intentional. Webb had studied the photographs for 4 years before Ford agreed to excavate. When the trenches went in, the radiocarbon dates confirmed what the geometry had suggested. The earthworks were approximately 35 centuries old. What Ford and Webb found inside the ridges, and what they found conspicuously absent, turned a routine excavation into a problem that has not been solved since. The 6 ridges at Poverty Point cover approximately 345 acres, each ridge standing up to 2 meters above the surrounding floodplain, arranged in a C shape that opens toward the bayou to the east. The largest earthwork on the site, Mound A, rises 21 meters at its peak over a base measuring roughly 210 by 180 meters. One of the largest mounds raised in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico. The estimated volume of earth moved to construct the full complex approaches 750,000 cubic meters. John Gibson of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, who spent 4 decades studying the site and published his comprehensive account in 2001, calculated that completing the ridge complex would have required approximately 53 million individual basket loads of earth, each basket carrying roughly 22 kilograms of fill. The people who built this were not farmers, not administrators of a surplus agricultural economy, not a society with domesticated draft animals or any form of wheeled transport. The population at Poverty Point was archaic period hunter-gatherers, living primarily by fishing the bayou, hunting the bottomland forests, and gathering the plants of the lower Mississippi floodplain. The calibrated radiocarbon dates place peak construction at 1700 to 1100 BCE, contemporary with the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, while Ramesses II was consolidating Egypt's new kingdom. The trade network centered at Poverty Point stretched across the entire eastern half of the continent. Copper from the Great Lakes region traveled more than 1,200 kilometers to reach the site. Galena from Missouri and Iowa sources arrived from 600 kilometers to the northwest. Soapstone for cooking vessels came from the Appalachian Piedmont, more than 1,000 kilometers to the northeast. Knife River flint from North Dakota, a geological source nearly 2,000 kilometers away, was napped into tools and deposited in the midden layers. Dozens of chert varieties from geological formations scattered across the continent appear in the artifact assemblage. Then, in 2014, T.R. Kidder of Washington University in St. Louis published results in geoarchaeology from a coring and sediment analysis study of Mound B, the second largest earthwork at the site. The analysis found no storm-deposited sediment layers within the mound matrix, no weathering horizons, no evidence of seasonal interruption. Mound B, Kidder concluded, was built in somewhere between 30 and 90 days. A hunter-gatherer community in the Louisiana Bayou raised a mound containing tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth in under 3 months. But here's where the evidence becomes structurally impossible to explain. Poverty Point has no archaeological signature of the social infrastructure required to do any of what the physical evidence shows it did. There are no permanent habitation structures within the earthwork complex, no administrative compound, no evidence of a resident elite class, no granaries or food storage facilities of the scale that could have supported the labor concentration required for construction. The ridge system was not a settlement in the conventional sense. The people who came here came for a purpose that archaeology has not yet identified, organized in ways that left no physical trace, and moved Earth at a rate that, in the 21st century, still draws engineers to the site to run the numbers again. Poverty Point was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014. Its 6 ridges are still visible from satellite imagery, arcing through the Louisiana floodplain with a geometry that requires no interpretation. The LiDAR surveys continue to add features to the map. And the organization that built this, the hierarchy, the logistics, the authority that moved 750,000 cubic meters of Earth, has left nothing behind. Only the Earth that was moved. Before we continue, if you want to go deeper on the physical evidence side of this, there's a 60-page ebook in the description. It covers the archaeological evidence confirming the Bible, excavations, artifacts, dating results. The link is right below this video. Number 9. The Stone Spheres of Costa Rica in the late 1930s. The United Fruit Company was clearing virgin rainforest in the Decas Delta of southern Costa Rica to plant banana plantations. The company ran bulldozers through the lowland jungle, and the bulldozers began hitting stone, not bedrock, spheres. Hundreds of nearly perfect stone spheres, ranging from the size of a human fist to formations larger than a man standing. Company workers, assuming valuables might be hidden inside, blasted several of them open with dynamite. They found nothing. The spheres were solid. Doris Stone, the daughter of a United Fruit executive and a researcher affiliated with Harvard's Peabody Museum, arrived to document them in 1943. She counted dozens accessible on cleared plantation land, photographed them, measured them, and published the first academic description in American antiquity the same year. By the time she finished her survey, she had already recorded the first of what would eventually become a documented inventory of approximately 300 spheres, with an unknown number lost to blasting, displacement, or resale before anyone with scientific instruments could examine them. The spheres are made primarily of gabbro and granodiorite igneous rock types found naturally in the Talamanca mountain range, the nearest source being tens of kilometers from the delta sites. Finished diameters range from 0.1 meters to 2.57 meters. The largest known example weighs approximately 16 metric tons. The geometric precision of the best preserved spheres is measurable. Some examples have been surveyed to within a few millimeters of perfect spherical geometry across their full circumference. Oscar Fonseca Zamora of the Universidad de Costa Rica led excavations in the 1980s and 1990s that placed the manufacturing tradition within the Chiric cultural period, spanning roughly 200 BCE to 1500 CE. The people who made them were speakers of Chibchan languages, descendants of populations that had occupied the isthmus for thousands of years. The mainstream explanation for the manufacturing technique involves controlled stone reduction, starting from a rough quarried block and repeatedly striking and grinding the surface until the shape converges on a sphere. Checking the geometry continuously by rolling the stone on flat surfaces. This process is mechanically feasible. It is also extraordinarily time-consuming for stones weighing tons. The toolset left at Chiric sites is stone on stone, no metal, no lathe, no fixed reference point beyond a human eye measuring against the horizon. There is a specific problem embedded in the manufacturing model that the literature has not resolved. A sphere that weighs 16 tons cannot be rolled across a flat checking surface at any point during production. The mass is non-movable by human labor alone once the block approaches its finished dimensions. The geometric check, rolling the form against a flat reference to identify high points, is available for spheres of modest size. For the multi-ton examples at Decus, the stonecutter had to carry the target geometry entirely in the mind and in the hands, correcting deviation by feel and by eye across a surface measured in square meters. The best examples at Decus suggest that process produced results within a few millimeters of perfect. No other pre-Columbian tradition anywhere in the Americas produced objects of this mass and this precision. What makes these spheres particularly unsettling is not the precision, it's what the precision required. The Decas Delta spheres were not made in isolation. Hundreds were manufactured over a period spanning more than a millennium. Consistent in geometry and material across a wide geographic area, by a population that left no written record, no iconographic tradition that would survive to explain the sphere's purpose, and no successor culture that preserved oral memory of why they were made. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century. The Sharik tradition peoples they encountered had no account of the sphere's function. The people who remembered were already gone. What archaeology cannot determine is where the spheres originally stood. The United Fruit Company's clearing operations in the 1940s and 1950s displaced hundreds of examples using heavy equipment before any systematic survey was possible. The original arrangements, if the spheres were positioned in patterns, alignments, or spatial relationships to each other or to the landscape, were destroyed before they could be recorded. Researcher Iphigenia Quintanilla Jimenez, surveying intact, undisturbed contexts at the Finca 6 site in later decades, found groupings of spheres positioned in linear arrangements, but whether those arrangements encoded astronomical information, territorial markers, or something else entirely has not been determined. 6 spheres were excavated from undisturbed contexts at Finca 6 and documented with full stratigraphic records before displacement. Finca 6 was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Component in 2014. The remaining undisturbed examples are being surveyed. The rest, the ones blasted open on banana plantation land in 1939, are fragments in the Dickus Delta soil. Whatever pattern they formed, if any, was erased before anyone thought to look. Number 8. The Hopewell Exchange Network in the summer of 1891. Warren K. Moorhead arrived at a farm in Ross County, Ohio, hired by the Peabody Museum of Harvard University to excavate a complex of burial mounds on a property called the Hopewell Farm. The mounds had been documented before. Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis had surveyed them in the 1840s and published the results in the Smithsonian's first major monograph in 1848, but no one had excavated them systematically with scientific methods. Moorhead opened the mounds over 2 field seasons. What he found in the burial chambers was so wildly inconsistent with his understanding of Ohio's pre-Columbian past that he spent the remainder of the trip writing detailed provenance notes for every object, cross-checking their locations against each other to confirm he was reading the stratigraphy correctly. He was reading it correctly. The items in the Hopewell mounds had traveled an extraordinary distance to get there, and what they told him about the culture that placed them is not something archaeology has fully explained in the century and a half since. Obsidian tools and flakes, raw material traced to Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, distance from Ross County, approximately 2,400 kilometers. Copper sheets and copper ornaments, raw material traced to the native copper deposits of the Lake Superior Basin, primarily the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. Distance, approximately 1,100 kilometers. Mica sheets, some cut into geometric and figurative shapes, raw material from the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Distance, over 800 kilometers. Marine shells, including conch and whelk, from the Gulf of Mexico coastline. Distance, over 1,800 kilometers. Shark teeth, same origin. Bear teeth, from grizzly bear populations in the Rocky Mountains. Alligator skulls, from the subtropical south. Meteoric iron, worked into tool blanks and ornamental forms, traced to meteorite fall zones in the mid-continent. The Hopewell Interaction Sphere, as Mark Seaman of Kent State University characterized the exchange system in foundational work, published across the 1970s and 1980s, operated from approximately 100 BCE to 400 C across a territory covering most of what is now the eastern and central United States. It was the largest organized exchange network in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, transporting prestige materials across a distance range that rivals the reach of Bronze Age Mediterranean trade networks. Dozens of independent mound-building communities participated. Objects produced from Gulf Coast shell appear in Ohio mounds. Objects produced from Lake Superior copper appear in Florida mounds. The distribution is coherent, patterned, and sustained across 4 centuries. But consider the implication. The Hopewell Exchange Network was operated by people who built no permanent cities, no market centers, no administrative capitals, no writing, no monumental infrastructure along the trade routes, no roads, no warehouses, no way stations. The communities that participated were semi-nomadic, seasonally mobile, living in small dispersed settlements along river systems. The entire continental exchange network operated through these small mobile populations, maintained across 4 centuries of accumulated relationship without any of the institutional infrastructure that conventional models of complex exchange require. The trade objects ended up in the burial mounds, not in storage facilities, not in redistribution centers, but placed with specific individuals in specific mounds at the moment of burial. The Hopewell interaction sphere left its physical evidence only in the ground, in the graves of the people who controlled access to the network. The routes themselves, the paths that connected Yellowstone obsidian to Ohio burial mounds, have no archaeological trace, no camp debris, no midpoint caches. The Continental Exchange Network passes through the landscape and leaves nothing to find until the moment an object arrives in a burial context 4 centuries after the network began. What the burial assemblages reveal, beyond the geographic origins of the raw materials, is a shared symbolic vocabulary that operated across the entire exchange zone. Platform pipes, stone-smoking pipes in the form of animals, humans, and hybrid figures, appear in consistent forms across Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana mounds, despite originating in different communities with no evidence of direct political connection. Mica cutouts in geometric forms, hands, bird claws, serpents, copper effigies beaten into sheets and shaped into specific ceremonial forms that recur in mounds separated by hundreds of kilometers. The shared forms suggest a shared cosmological framework, a set of beliefs about the relationships between animals, humans, water, sky, and the dead. That circulated through the exchange network along with the raw materials. Mark Seaman has described this as a religious movement as much as an economic one. A continental network of belief, maintained by small mobile communities across 4 centuries, with no institutional center and no surviving text. The trade objects are still there, in the mounds that haven't been disturbed, and in the museum collections from the mounds that have. Yellowstone obsidian in Ohio, Gulf shark teeth in the Great Lakes region. The roots that connected them are invisible in the ground, and the social architecture that maintained them for 4 centuries has left nothing that explains how it worked. Number 7. Ciudad Blanca in January 2015. A team of archaeologists led by Christopher Fisher of Colorado State University spent days hacking through the Mesquite rainforest of Honduras's La Mesquite region before the coordinates resolved into reality. The team had coordinates from a LiDAR survey conducted in 2012, light detection and ranging, an airborne laser mapping technology that penetrates jungle canopy and returns ground surface elevation data with centimeter-level precision. The survey had been commissioned by filmmakers Steve Elkins and Bill Benenson in collaboration with the Honduran Institute of Anthropology and History. When Fisher's team processed the 2012 data, they had seen an ancient urban complex buried under forest cover so dense that it had hidden from every ground survey, every aerial photograph, and every expedition that had searched for it for over 4 centuries. When Fisher's boots finally hit the site itself in January 2015, the sound underfoot changed, hollow in places. The way ground sounds when it covers something constructed. The LiDAR data had revealed a city. The ground team confirmed it. A central plaza complex measuring several hundred meters across, flanked by low earthen mounds, pyramid platforms graded in descending hierarchy from a central raised feature to outlying residential terracing. Causeways connecting mounded areas. Agricultural terracing extending up the surrounding slopes. At the plaza's edge, a cache of 52 stone artifacts protruding from the soil, carved stone vessels, a jaguar serpent transformation figure, a vulture sculpture, a rubber ball player figurine, pestles and grinding stones of basalt. The artifacts had not been looted. They appeared to have been placed deliberately, an offering deposit, left in a configuration that had remained undisturbed for approximately 5 centuries beneath the accumulating forest floor. Zooarchaeological analysis conducted by Thomas Wake of UCLA's Kotzen Institute of Archaeology identified species assemblages consistent with intensive occupation and organized feasting. Preliminary radiocarbon dating of charcoal from midden deposits placed the occupation period at approximately 1000 to 1500 C. Fisher's team, in a 2015 publication in the National Geographic Society's supported report series, estimated the urban core at a minimum of 14 square kilometers, with the full associated settlement system, including agricultural infrastructure, extending considerably beyond that. The artifact cache itself requires attention. The 52 stone objects were found at the northeast corner of the main plaza, in a configuration Fisher's team described as consistent with deliberate deposition, an offering placed at a specific location rather than abandonment debris. The objects were partially embedded in soil, suggesting they had been placed upright or in specific orientations before the earth covered them. The jaguar serpent transformation figure, a stone throne or altar seat depicting a human figure emerging from the jaws of a large feline, is the most elaborate piece in the deposit. The iconography is unfamiliar. The jaguar serpent composite appears in other Mesoamerican traditions, but the specific formal conventions of the Mesquitia piece do not map onto any known cultural tradition with documented continuity. Whoever placed these objects in the northeast corner of this plaza had a cosmological framework that archaeology has no other window into. The ceramic traditions were anomalous. They did not match the Maya, the Aztec, the Toltec, or any other named Mesoamerican civilization with a documented archaeological profile. The architectural conventions were distinct from all known traditions in the region. The site appeared to represent a culture that had developed in the Mesquitia lowlands without significant integration into the Mesoamerican cultural systems that dominated the surrounding regions. In 2017 and 2018, additional LiDAR surveys commissioned by the Honduran Institute and conducted with support from Fisher's team identified at least 19 associated sites in the same river valley, suggesting the 2015 discovery was not an isolated anomaly, but the center of a regional civilization. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what was found. It's what the find reveals about the completeness of the received picture. A civilization that built a city covering at least 14 square kilometers, maintained regional networks across at least 19 identified sites, sustained a distinct material culture over a period of approximately 5 centuries, and then disappeared before the arrival of Spanish colonizers, leaving no descendant culture that preserved its name, no oral tradition in the surrounding populations that accurately describes its location, no object in any European collection that can be traced back to it, did not feature in any model of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization before 2015. Not as a known gap, not as an inferred presence, simply not there. The Honduran rainforest is consuming the site at a rate that archaeological conservators estimate destroys organic material at approximately 2 to 3 centimeters of vertical context per decade. The stone artifacts from the cache are being documented. The architecture is being mapped. The excavation of the full urban complex, the work that would establish the civilization's name. Its temporal span, its origins, has not been funded at the scale required. The city sits in the jungle, known now, and still largely unread. Number 6. Teotihuacan Mica. In the first decade of the 20th century, the Mexican government commissioned Leopoldo Batres, the inspector and conservator of Mexican monuments, to conduct restoration work on the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, the massive pre-Columbian city site in the highlands northeast of what is now Mexico City. Batres worked on the pyramid from 1905 to 1910, stripping outer layers of the structure to expose earlier construction phases and stabilize the visible surface. During that excavation, workers encountered mica, not trace quantities, not decorative inlay. Large sheets of mica, deliberately placed within the structure's construction sequence, in amounts that bore no relationship to any known ceremonial use of the material. Batres documented the presence and moved on. The mica was removed from the site. Contemporary accounts suggest it was sold. The stratigraphic record of exactly where within the pyramid's construction matrix those sheets were positioned was not preserved with the precision that later archaeological standards would require. The primary evidence, the mica itself, in its original context, is gone. What survives is the documentation of its existence. The mica compound elsewhere at Teotihuacan is better documented. In the zone of the Avenue of the Dead complex, archaeologists working in later decades identified a building compound that has been informally designated the mica building, a structure whose floor levels incorporate substantial sheets of mica laid beneath finishing plaster, deliberately installed as part of the building's original construction rather than added as a secondary element. The compound is not a pyramid or a public ceremonial structure. It is a building of significant scale in the administrative and residential zone of one of the ancient world's largest urban centers, and its floors are built on mica. The geological origin of Teotihuacan's mica deposits has been examined by materials analysts, and the composition of the samples does not match the mica sources closest to the site. The material is consistent with mica formations from geological regions significantly farther south, sources that would have required transport across thousands of kilometers of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican territory to reach the Teotihuacan Highland Basin. Teotihuacan was the dominant urban and economic center of ancient Mesoamerica during its peak between roughly 200 BCE and 600 C, with a population estimated by Ren Millon of the University of Rochester, who produced the definitive mapping project of the city at between 100,000 and 200,000 people. The city conducted long-distance exchange of obsidian, ceramics, and craft goods across Mesoamerica. The logistical capacity to acquire large quantities of mica from distant sources was within its organizational reach. But here's where the industrial context becomes impossible to dismiss without explaining what it means. Mica has specific physical properties. It is an electrical insulator. It is resistant to extremely high temperatures, maintaining structural integrity up to approximately 800 degrees Celsius. It is effectively transparent to certain forms of electromagnetic radiation while blocking others. In the 20th century, these properties made it indispensable for electrical capacitors, heat-resistant windows in industrial furnaces, and shielding applications in contexts involving radioactive material and specialized electronics. None of these applications existed in ancient Mesoamerica. None of the tools, devices, or industrial processes for which mica would be functionally necessary are present in the Teotihuacan archaeological record. So the question the mica deposits pose is not whether they exist. They do. And not whether their placement was deliberate. The construction sequence confirms it was. The question is, what function was being served by installing large sheets of electrically insulating, thermally resistant, electromagnetically selective material in the floors of buildings and within the construction matrix of major pyramid structures at the largest city in the ancient Americas? No consensus has formed. The interpretations offered in the academic literature, ritual significance, symbolic value as a shining material associated with celestial reflectivity, explain the presence of mica in decorative quantities. They do not explain industrial scale installation in structural contexts. The mica building compound at Teotihuacan still stands at the site, accessible to visitors. The mica floors are cataloged. The site has been studied continuously for over a century. What function requires industrial-grade mica buried in the structural sequence of a religious and administrative monument in the ancient Americas is a question that the academic literature poses and does not answer. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Back to it. Number 5. The Newark Earthworks in 1820. A surveying team led by Caleb Atwater published measurements of an enormous geometric earthwork complex near the Licking River in central Ohio, documenting circles, octagonal enclosures, and parallel walled avenues connecting them across a landscape covering several square miles. Atwater's measurements were imprecise by modern standards. No one at the time had the tools to ask the more difficult question. It wasn't until 1982 that two researchers, Ray Hively, a professor of physics at Earlham College, and Robert Horn, a philosopher at the same institution, published a paper in Archaeoastronomy, the supplementary journal of the Journal for the History of Astronomy, that the full implication of the Newark earthworks geometry became apparent. What Hively and Horn published would be replicated and extended by subsequent researchers over the following 4 decades and has never been satisfactorily refuted. The Newark earthworks, at their greatest extent, covered approximately 4 square miles, the largest geometric earthwork complex ever constructed by any pre-Columbian culture in the Western Hemisphere. The complex was built by the Hopewell tradition, the same culture responsible for the exchange network described elsewhere in this list. During a construction period spanning approximately 100 BCE to 500 CE. The principal components include a great circle, an approximately circular earthen enclosure with an interior diameter of roughly 365 meters, an octagon and observatory circle connected to it by parallel walls, a smaller circle, and a series of avenues and walls extending across the surrounding landscape. The enclosure walls reach heights of 4 to 7 meters in the best preserved sections. The alignment appeared coincidental when Atwater measured it in 1820. Then, Hively and Horn ran the numbers. The octagon's 8 walls and their connecting openings encode a set of astronomical alignments that the researchers initially assumed would require a large number of significant observations to confirm. Instead, they found a single dominant pattern embedded in the complex's geometry. The Newark octagon and observatory circle encodes, with remarkable precision, the full 18. 6-year lunar standstill cycle. The moon's rising and setting points along the horizon shift over a complex pattern, not the simple annual cycle of the sun, but a long-term oscillation tied to the regression of the moon's orbital nodes. The full cycle completes itself in 18.61 years. At Newark, every significant wall alignment in the octagon corresponds to a lunar standstill position. The 4 major standstill events and the 4 minor ones, with the alignments accurate to within fractions of a degree of the theoretical positions. Specifically, the octagon's long axis aligns to the moonrise at the northern major standstill, the northernmost point along the horizon where the moon rises during the 18.6-year cycle. A separate wall axis aligns to the moonset at the southern major standstill. The observatory circle's entrance aligns to the rising of the full moon at northern minor standstill. The entire complex, taken as a unit, functions as an observing platform from which a person standing at the center of the observatory circle can witness, in order over 18. 6 years, every significant position the moon occupies at its rising and setting. To build it required knowing in advance where those positions would be, which requires sustained observation across multiple complete cycles before construction began. Bradley T. Lepper of the Ohio History Connection, who has studied the Newark earthworks for decades, confirmed and extended Hively and Horn's findings. The survey precision required to build the octagon to these alignments, in a time before metal measuring instruments, before written mathematical notation, before any documented astronomical tradition in the region, would require sustained observation of the lunar standstill cycle over multiple 18.6-year periods to establish the baseline positions, and a geometric planning and execution capacity that archaeologists have not found physical evidence of anywhere in the associated Hopewell cultural record. What makes Newark particularly haunting is not the scale, it's the precision. The 18.6-year lunar cycle is not an obvious target. It is not as visible or as immediately useful as the annual solar cycle. It requires continuous observation across nearly 2 decades to detect, and another cycle or 2 to confirm. A surveying team that encoded it accurately in earthworks, covering 4 square miles, was doing astronomy of a kind that European observers did not formalize until the scientific revolution, with instruments that Hopewell culture did not leave behind. The Newark Octagon is the best preserved section of the complex. It now contains a golf course. The Mound Builders Country Club has held a lease on the land since 1910. The earthen walls of an ancient monument encoding the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle mark the fairway boundaries of a private golf club in central Ohio. The walls are still there. The alignments are still accurate. The culture that knew to build them has been gone for 1,500 years, and the mechanism by which they acquired that knowledge has not been found. Number 4. The Nazca Lines in June 1941. Paul Kosok, a historian at Long Island University studying ancient irrigation systems in coastal Peru, found himself standing in the Nazca Desert just as the sun was setting. He had come to the Pampa, a high, flat tableland of gravel and oxidized iron between the Andes and the Pacific coast, looking for traces of ancient water management. He had noticed the lines from the ground and assumed them to be irrigation channels. He was watching the sun go down. On that specific evening, June 21, the setting sun aligned directly with one of the lines stretching across the desert floor. Kosok recognized immediately what date it was, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. He called the Nazca Pampa the world's largest astronomy book. He was not wrong, though the story is more complicated than a simple calendar. Maria Reich, a German mathematician and archaeologist, arrived in Peru in 1946 and spent the next 4 decades documenting the Nazca Lines. Working largely alone, often sleeping in the desert, she hand-surveyed hundreds of linear features, trapezia, and figurative geoglyphs across the plateau. The figures she mapped: a hummingbird spanning 96 meters, a condor spanning 134 meters, a spider measuring 46 meters across, a whale, a monkey with a spiraling tail, a stylized human figure visible only from altitude, are made by removing the dark, oxidized surface stones of the desert pavement to reveal the lighter, yellowish-gray soil beneath. The technique requires only labor and a reference point, but executing it at scales visible only from the air requires a grid or template system that has never been found in the material record. The Nazca Lines were created by the Nazca culture, a pre-Columbian civilization that occupied the south coastal and foothill regions of Peru between approximately 200 BCE and 600 C. The culture is well attested in the archaeological record, extensive cemeteries, a ceramic tradition with over 30 identified design phases, evidence of a sophisticated understanding of regional hydrology, including the construction of underground aqueducts called puquios. They left no writing. The lines are not labeled. The figures have no accompanying text explaining what they depict or why they were made. But here's where the standard explanation for the lines falls apart. The astronomer hypothesis that the lines served as a Nazca calendar system was comprehensively tested by the astronomer Anthony Aveni of Colgate University and a multidisciplinary team in the 1980s. Their conclusion, published in a 1990 monograph commissioned by the American Philosophical Society, was that the lines do not consistently align to astronomical phenomena. Some lines align to solar or stellar events, most do not. The astronomical calendar model explains a subset of the lines and ignores the rest. The most comprehensive recent hypothesis, developed by David Brown and Helene Silverman, connects the lines to ritual pathways associated with water sources and mountain shrines, the lines as ceremonial walking routes rather than observatory alignments. This model fits the distribution of lines relative to water sources reasonably well. It does not explain why the walking routes were designed to be legible only from altitude. Then, in 2018 and 2019, a team from Yamagata University, led by Masato Sakai, conducted systematic LiDAR and drone surveys of the plateau and identified 143 previously undocumented geoglyphs, increasing the total figure inventory to over 190 confirmed figurative forms, plus hundreds of linear and geometric features. The new figures, many located in areas that ground survey could not efficiently cover, include representations of humans, animals, and hybrid forms executed in a style distinct from the classical Nazca figures, documented by Reich. The Nazca Plateau is still yielding new imagery in 2024. The people who made the lines were making more of them, in more places, across a longer time span, than even the researchers who spent their careers on the plateau had established. Sakai's surveys also identified a spatial pattern the classical inventory had not revealed. The newer figures tend to cluster near ancient pathways leading to the hills at the plateau's edge, and a significant number are positioned adjacent to lines that end at the base of the surrounding mountains. This is consistent with the hydraulic ritual hypothesis. The lines as ceremonial routes connecting lowland plazas to highland water sources, but it is also consistent with an astronomical function in which the hills themselves served as horizon markers for observing rising and setting positions. The two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. They are also not jointly complete. Neither the hydraulic model nor the astronomical model accounts for the full distribution. The lines were made for a reason the Nazca culture understood, and that has not fully survived the culture's disappearance. The Nazca lines are the most surveyed set of geoglyphs on Earth. They have been studied continuously since the 1940s. The LiDAR surveys are ongoing. Every new survey round finds figures that the previous round missed. The plateau keeps disclosing what it contains, slowly, over generations of researchers working in the same desert. The 143 figures found in 2018 and 2019 had been there since the Nazca made them. No one had seen them yet. Number 3. The pre-Clovis problem in the fall of 1975. Tom Dillehay. A young archaeologist at the Universidad Austral de Chile in Valdivia walked out to a site on the bank of Chinchihuapi Creek, about 40 kilometers north of the city of Portimont in southern Chile, where a colleague had noticed bones and odd stone objects eroding from the bank. Dillehay looked at the sediment sequence and saw something that made him return the following year, and then the year after that, and then for the better part of the next 2 decades. The site was called Monte Verde. What it contained was, by the conventional account of human prehistory in the Americas that had been accepted since the late 1930s, impossible. The standard model had been established primarily through the work of Edgar B. Howard at the Blackwater Draw site near Clovis, New Mexico, in 1932 and subsequent years. Howard found sophisticated bifacially fluted projectile points, Clovis points, in clear stratigraphic association with the bones of mammoths and extinct horses, dated to approximately 13,000 years ago. The Clovis first model held that the ancestors of all Native Americans crossed a land bridge across what is now the Bering Strait from northeastern Asia, moving south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as the last glacial maximum retreated, and that Clovis culture represented the founding technological tradition. There had been no credible evidence of human presence in the Americas before approximately 13,000 years ago. No site had survived the burden of proof. Monte Verde survived it. Dillehay's excavation, conducted over 12 field seasons and published in 2 volumes through the Smithsonian Institution Press, the first in 1989, the second in 1997, documented an occupation site of extraordinary preservation. Wood, fiber, bone, and plant material survived in waterlogged anaerobic conditions that had protected organic material from decay. The site contained a residential structure, a rectangular arrangement of wooden poles with attached animal skin walls, preserved in situ. Hearths with charcoal. Food remains including mastodon bones with cut marks, edible plant species gathered from multiple ecological zones up to 700 kilometers from the site, and quantities of wild potato. Medical or ceremonial plant materials, including a boldo leaf, a plant used for its pharmaceutical properties, that had been chewed and spat out, preserving the impression of teeth. The radiocarbon dates from Monte Verde II, the primary occupation layer, ranged from 14,500 to 18,500 calibrated years before present. Conservative estimates center on approximately 14,500 to 15,000 years ago. The establishment resisted the dates for years. A formal delegation of skeptical archaeologists, including Dana Dincause of the University of Massachusetts and other leading figures, visited the site in 1997 to assess Dillehay's evidence. They returned and confirmed it. Monte Verde was real. The dates were real. The Clovis first model was not. For that conclusion alone, Monte Verde would rank among the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But then, Oregon changed the calculation. The Paisley 5-mile point caves in south-central Oregon produced coprolites, preserved human feces, from stratified deposits dated by Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon, in work published in Science in 2008, to approximately 14,300 years before present. The human origin of the coprolites was confirmed by ancient DNA analysis, identifying mitochondrial haplogroups associated with Native American founding populations. Earlier than Clovis, unambiguous in origin. And then, Pennsylvania changed it further. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in southwestern Pennsylvania, excavated by J.M. Otto Vasio of the University of Pittsburgh, beginning in 1973, produced occupation evidence dated across multiple seasons and multiple independent laboratory analyses to approximately 16,000 years before present. Otto Vasio spent 3 decades defending the dates against accusations of contamination and methodological error. The dates were replicated. The site is now generally accepted. The truly unsettling implication isn't that one site produced anomalous dates. It's that multiple independent sites, Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Paisley Caves in Oregon, all yielded pre-Clovis dates. Each was excavated by a different team. Each was dated by independent radiocarbon laboratories. Each produced different material culture and different preservation conditions. For their convergence to be coincidental error, the error must extend not just to one excavation, but to 3 independent programs in 3 independent institutions, in 3 different American states, and 1 other country, all producing results that are consistent with each other and inconsistent with the model they collectively undermine. The Clovis first model is no longer defended by the mainstream of American archaeology. Monte Verde is accepted. Meadowcroft is accepted. Paisley is accepted. The new consensus holds that humans were present in the Americas by at least 16,000 years ago, possibly 18,000 or more, and reached the southern tip of Chile by at least 14,500. How they got there, whether via an early coastal route along the Pacific ice margin, or via an Atlantic route, or via some other pathway not yet identified, remains unresolved. The model that replaced Clovis first has no agreed mechanism. The evidence precedes the explanation, and the explanation is not yet written. Number 2. Pumapunku in 1932, Wendell C. Bennett of the American Museum of Natural History arrived at the site complex of Tiwanaku near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, at an elevation of approximately 3,840 meters above sea level, and began what would become the first systematic excavation of the site by a foreign institution. Tiwanaku had been known to Europeans since the Spanish colonial period. Pedro Cieza de Len described the site in 1553, writing that the stonework he saw was unlike anything he had encountered elsewhere in the Andes, and that the local population had no account of who had built it. Bennett's excavations extended over multiple seasons and produced the first stratigraphic sequence for the site. Placing its peak occupation between approximately 500 and 900 C, based on ceramic evidence. Carbon dating of organic material associated with later occupations confirmed occupation through the mid-1st millennium C. Pumapunku is the southwestern platform complex of the Tiwanaku site, a raised artificial mound approximately 167 meters by 116 meters at its base, with a central sunken court and a series of platforms constructed from stones of enormous individual mass. The platform was built using 3 different types of stone: red sandstone from a quarry approximately 10 kilometers from the site, and andesite and other igneous stone types from quarries near the Copacabana Peninsula on the far side of Lake Titicaca, approximately 90 kilometers from the construction site. The largest single andesite block at Pumapunku weighs in the range of 130 metric tons. It sits where it was placed, at 3,800 meters above sea level, moved from a quarry that required crossing a large lake or circumnavigating it by land. Jean-Pierre Protzen, of the University of California at Berkeley, who spent years studying the stone-cutting techniques at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, published work in the 1990s documenting the tool marks and reduction patterns on the stone surfaces. The cuts are precise. The H-shaped blocks, a distinctive architectural unit found in large quantities at Pumapunku, each featuring multiple interlocking surfaces cut at compound angles, show consistent geometry across independent units. The interlock angles are repeated with an accuracy that, if achieved by freehand stone working, would require a level of skill that exceeds any documented parallel in pre-Columbian South American architecture. The blocks were designed to fit together in specific orientations, some configurations only possible if assembled in a defined sequence, creating a locking system that would resist displacement without the use of mortar. Arthur Posnansky, a Bolivian-Austrian scholar who spent decades at Tiwanaku beginning in the 1900s, approached the site differently than Bennett. Where Bennett dated the occupation through ceramic stratigraphy, Posnansky applied astronomical analysis to the site's alignments. The Kalasasaya, the larger platform complex adjacent to Pumapunku, incorporates walls and gateway alignments that appear to have been designed to observe solstice and equinox events. Posnansky measured the apparent solar path angle encoded in those alignments and compared it to calculated historical values, concluding the Kalasasaya was built approximately 15,000 to 17,000 years ago. Posnansky's dating was rejected by mainstream archaeology on the grounds that the alignment measurements were imprecise and the ceramic evidence contradicted such an early date. But the ceramic evidence dates occupational layers at the site, not the original construction of the stone structures. No one has definitively resolved this. Posnansky's conclusion has been dismissed. It has not been systematically disproven. Beneath the Pumapunku platform, 20th century archaeologists documented a sophisticated drainage system, stone channels designed to carry water from the plaza surface through the base of the mound and out to the surrounding ground. The drainage system required planning the water management infrastructure before the upper platform was constructed, meaning the builders had to engineer the subsurface in anticipation of surface conditions they had not yet built. The system still functions, water still moves through the channels, though the platform above it has been largely destroyed. But the mainstream account of the construction technique, patient stone reduction using harder stone hammers, steady grinding against abrasive surfaces, accumulated craft skill over generations runs into a specific problem. The tools found at Tiwanaku sites are copper chisels, stone hammers, and abrasive stones. Jean-Pierre Protzen replicated aspects of the cutting technique using copper chisels and found it plausible for the softer red sandstone. For the harder andesite and diorite blocks at Pumapunku, copper tools would deform and dull against the material at a rate that makes the precision observed in the finished surfaces a mechanical challenge that the experimental archaeology has not yet fully demonstrated. The compound angles, the repeated identical cross-sections across unrelated blocks, the surface regularity across large planar faces. Consider the implication of what the tools cannot do. The H-blocks at Pumapunku were cut, shaped, fitted, and placed by a culture that had copper tools, stone abrasives, and human labor. This is what the material record shows. The finished surfaces show a precision that the experimental replication of those same tools has not consistently reproduced on comparable material. The 130-ton andesite blocks were moved from a quarry on the far side of a lake 90 kilometers away, either ferried across the water on balsa reed boats or hauled around the lakeshore on a route without roads. The assembly sequence of the H-blocks was fixed before the first block was placed, requiring the builders to hold the complete architecture in mind from the beginning. The H-blocks of Pumapunku are still at the site. Some have been displaced by centuries of looting. Spanish colonists quarried Tiwanaku extensively to build the town of Tiwanaku itself, and colonial records indicate that the site was mined for dressed stone so thoroughly that it was described in the 18th century as already mostly demolished. What remains is a fraction of what was built. The andesite surfaces of the surviving blocks have been analyzed by Protzen, by Alexei Vronich of the University of California at Berkeley, and by others. The copper tools are in museum collections. The drainage system still drains. The gap between the tools and the collections and the surfaces those tools are supposed to have produced is still open, at 3,840 meters above sea level, where the air is thin and the stones have been there for over 1,000 years and still hold their angles. Number 1. The Cerruti Mastodon. In May 1992, a Caltrans crew was operating a backhoe on a highway expansion project in the Otay area of southern San Diego County, cutting through compacted sediment to widen State Route 54. The backhoe bucket struck bone. The operator stopped the machine, and a supervisor made the call to the San Diego Natural History Museum. Thomas Demmer, the museum's curator of paleontology, arrived and looked at what the excavation had exposed: large bones, visibly old, the characteristic shape of a mastodon, Mammet americanum, a large proboscidean that went extinct in North America approximately 10 to 13,000 years ago. Standard procedure: document it, recover what can be recovered, note the location, file it. Demmer's team spent the next 5 months at the site. What they found in the process of careful excavation shifted the site from routine to something else entirely. The mastodon bones, ribs, vertebrae, molars, and 2 separate tusk fragments showed spiral fractures. Not the random cracking of fossilization, not the compression fractures of geological pressure. Spiral fractures are produced by impact force applied to bone that is still fresh, still containing collagen, still flexible. Bone breaks spirally when it is struck hard while it retains its living tissue structure, typically within hours to days of death. The spiral fracture pattern across multiple Cerruti mastodon bones was consistent with deliberate impact, the kind applied when extracting marrow. Alongside the bones, the team found 5 rounded cobblestones. The cobbles were not geologically native to the deposit. They came from a different stratigraphic unit, a different rock type, a different origin from the sediment surrounding them. Their presence in the bone deposit was not explainable by natural deposition. 2 of the cobbles showed use wear patterns on their surfaces consistent with repeated hard impact, the battered faces of hammerstones and anvil stones used to process bone. The spatial distribution of the bones and cobbles, recorded in 3 dimensions during excavation, showed the pattern characteristic of human bone processing sites, scatter consistent with deliberate fracture and marrow extraction rather than random animal trampling or geological displacement. The site was documented. The materials were collected. The bones and cobbles were deposited in the museum's collections, where they remained for 25 years. In 2017, Demmer assembled an international team to date the site using methods that had not been available in 1992. The team included Stephen Holen of the Center for American Paleolithic Research, Daniel Fisher of the University of Michigan's Museum of Paleontology, Richard Fullagar of the University of Wollongong in Australia, and geochemist James Paces of the U.S. Geological Survey. 3 independent dating methods were applied to the bone and associated sediments: uranium series dating on bone fragments, electron spin resonance on tooth enamel, and uranium series on carbonate coatings on the bone surfaces. The 3 methods, run independently, produced results that converged on a single age estimate. The results? Approximately 130,700 years before present, with an error range of plus or minus 9,400 years. The paper was submitted to Nature, the most cited scientific journal in the world, with an editorial board that subjects paleontological claims of this magnitude to extended peer review. The paper went through revisions. Then, on April 26, 2017, it was published. Nature, Volume 544, pages 479 to 403. Title: A 130,000-year-old archaeological site in Southern California, USA. What makes this particularly impossible to dismiss is not the dating. It's what that date requires. At 130,700 years ago, the established timeline of human prehistory has the following characteristics: Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, had not yet left Africa in any significant migration. The founding populations that would eventually reach Asia, Europe, and the Americas had not yet separated from their African origins. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals were alive. In Eastern Asia, the fossil record indicates populations of archaic Homo sapiens and possibly Denisovans. The enigmatic hominin group, known primarily from a finger bone and several teeth recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia, whose full geographic range remains undefined. Not a single pre-sapiens hominin site has ever been documented anywhere in the Americas. Not one. The entire recorded human presence in the Americas, from all excavations conducted across more than a century of professional archaeology, fits within a window of 13,000 to 18,000 years at most, and even the pre-Clovis sites that push that window back to 18,000 years are still separated from the Ceruti mastodon by approximately 112,000 years. At 130,000 years, someone processed a mastodon in what is now San Diego County. The spiral fractures are in the bone. The hammerstones are in the deposit. The dates are published in Nature. Who that was, what hominin, what population, what migration event, is not answered anywhere in the known archaeological record of the Western Hemisphere. The response from the American archaeological establishment was fierce. David Meltzer of Southern Methodist University, one of the leading authorities on the peopling of the Americas, told Science magazine that the implications would be so extraordinary that the evidence needed to be extraordinary, and he was not convinced it was. Daniel Amick of Loyola University Chicago argued that the bone fractures could have resulted from natural trampling by other proboscideans at a water source, that the cobbles could have arrived in the deposit through natural hydraulic transport, that the use-wear patterns on the stones were ambiguous. These are legitimate methodological objections. They are not refutations. Demar and Holin addressed the counter-arguments. The spatial distribution of fractured bone and the specific cobble types and their spatial relationship to the bone are inconsistent with trampling. Natural hydraulic transport of cobbles into the deposit is possible, but would not produce the differential wear patterns observed on specific faces of specific stones. The uranium series dates on 3 independent substrates, bone, enamel, and carbonate, converging on the same age estimate rule out the most common form of dating error. The author's responses are in the published literature. The counter-arguments are in the published literature. The debate has not been resolved. No follow-up excavation of the surrounding Caltrans corridor has been funded. The highway expansion was completed. The bones from the Ceruti Mastodon site are in the collections of the San Diego Natural History Museum, cataloged and available to qualified researchers. The Nature paper has not been retracted. The uranium series dates have not been disproven by an independent replication study. The institutional response, skepticism, methodological critique, and then, after 7 years, a persistent and unresolved silence is the record. At 130,700 years ago, in a sediment deposit now beneath a highway in San Diego County, an unknown hominin was using stones to break open mastodon bone and extract the marrow. Everything archaeology knows about when and how and who came to the Americas says this is not possible. The bones still say otherwise. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.